The emergence of the State of Israel on the world map stands as one of the most remarkable events in the political history of the 20th century. Many assume that the date of its founding marked merely the beginning of its story. In reality, however, it represented the final culmination, the ultimate outcome of decades of struggle and conflict. In this article, we will explore precisely how the Jewish people succeeded in establishing their own sovereign state. How did the global superpowers determine the fate of an entirely new nation appearing on the political map? Why did the Soviet Union, a staunch opponent of Zionism, unexpectedly, and to the astonishment of the entire world, lend its support to the creation of Israel? And the most critical question of all, why, just 24 hours after the country's official inception, did 5 neighboring states simultaneously declare war upon it? Ancient roots and a lost home. The history of Jewish statehood dates back to the 2nd millennium BCE. According to the Bible, Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, was bequeathed to the Jewish people as the Promised Land. It is here that the principal Jewish holy sites remain situated to this day. However, the ancient kingdoms of Israel and Judea, which arose in this very region, were repeatedly conquered and annexed by various invaders throughout history. In 63 BCE, the Judean state lost its independence, becoming a Roman protectorate. During the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, the Jewish people rose up in rebellion against the Romans on 2 separate occasions. The first uprising ended with the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the Temple. The second, following the suppression of the Bar Kokhba revolt in 135 CE, resulted in the Romans expelling vast numbers of Jews from Judea and renaming the province Syria Palestina. This measure was taken specifically to expunge, even from the very name of the region, any trace or reminder that Jews had once inhabited the land. The long road home, the first Aliyot. Over the centuries that followed, Jews continued to migrate to Palestine periodically, though the scale of these migrations remained relatively modest. The first truly major wave of Jewish return to the Holy Land, then a province of the Ottoman Empire, began in 1882. Over the course of several decades, 35,000 Jews relocated there, fleeing pogroms in Eastern Europe, and joined the 20,000 Jews already residing in Ottoman Palestine. Financial and organizational matters were facilitated by the wealthy French philanthropist Baron Edmond de Rothschild, a man of Jewish descent. This period of Jewish history is known as the First Aliyah. At the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, Jewish communities across Europe began actively purchasing land in Palestine. Most often, they acquired rocky, swampy, or sandy plots, parcels where farming was a difficult undertaking. At the time of purchase, these lands lay uncultivated and were dirt cheap. However, the Arab population soon realized that Jewish demand for their land was high and began to inflate prices. There was yet another obstacle. The Ottoman government, seeking to stem Jewish immigration, imposed restrictions on land sales to Jews. Yet these prohibitions proved ineffective. Officials within the Ottoman administration in Palestine accepted bribes and turned a blind eye to the transactions. The new landowners began introducing agricultural techniques previously unknown in Palestine, and even the most desolate plots were transformed into fertile land. Arab farmers, too, eventually began to adopt these methods from the Jews. The birth of political Zionism. In 1897, the First World Zionist Congress was held in Basel, Switzerland, where the World Zionist Organization was established. It was led by Theodor Herzl, an Austro-Hungarian journalist and playwright of Jewish descent from Budapest. He became the founder of political Zionism, a movement dedicated to uniting the Jewish people in Eretz Israel. Herzl engaged in negotiations with European leaders, seeking to secure their support. He met with the Turkish Sultan Abdul Hamid II and the German Kaiser Wilhelm II. Herzl also sought an audience with the Russian Emperor Nicholas II,
but without success. The emperor showed no substantive interest in the Zionist project. Herzl died in 1904, having never lived to see tangible successes for the future state of Israel. Nevertheless, it was he who succeeded in convincing Jews worldwide that the time had come for them to establish a country of their own. In 1904, the second Aliyah began. It lasted for 10 years, during which up to 40,000 people immigrated to Ottoman Palestine. Almost all of them were natives of the Russian Empire who were fleeing pogroms. It was largely thanks to the second Aliyah that a vigorous campaign to establish kibbutzim, agricultural communes where all members share collective property, began in Palestine. To protect the settlers throughout Palestine, Jews established a paramilitary organization called HaShomer, thereby dispensing with the services of Arab and Circassian hired guards, whose reliability and competence were often questionable. The Jewish settlement of Palestine continued. In 1902, the privately owned Anglo-Palestine Bank was established. Today, it is the country's largest commercial bank. In 1918, the Hebrew University of Jerusalem was founded and opened 7 years later. Incidentally, it was to this institution that Albert Einstein bequeathed all his manuscripts and letters, as well as the rights to the commercial use of his name and image. The British Mandate and the escalation of the conflict. Following the conclusion of World War I, the Ottoman Empire lost control over Palestine. On November 2, 1917, British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour sent a declaration to the leader of the British Jewish community, Lord Walter Rothschild, pledging to assist the Jewish people in establishing a national home of their own in Palestine. This was the exact wording used, without the word state. In 1918, the Balfour Declaration received the support of the United States, Spain, and France. In 1922, acting on the basis of the Balfour Declaration, the League of Nations endorsed the British Mandate for Palestine. At the time, this term referred to the territory now occupied by present-day Palestine, Israel, Jordan, and parts of Saudi Arabia. The mandated territories were effectively divided into Palestine, where Britain was tasked with facilitating the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people, and the Emirate of Transjordan, which was created in 1921 on the lands situated east of the Jordan River. Meanwhile, 2 more waves of Aliyah took place. The largest of these, the 5th Aliyah to Palestine, began in 1929 and continued until the late 1930s, during which time approximately 250,000 Jews fled to Palestine to escape the rising threat of Nazism. Palestine was becoming increasingly overcrowded, and the conflict between the newcomers and the Arab population was intensifying. In 1936, local Arabs launched a revolt against British rule in Palestine, demanding the creation of an Arab state and an end to Jewish immigration. By this time, approximately 450,000 Jews were already living in Palestine, 1/3 of the country's population. The uprising was suppressed, but Britain could not ignore the interests of the Arab majority. Consequently, in 1939, it issued the so-called White Paper. According to this document, no more than 75,000 Jews would be permitted to enter the country over the next 5 years. Thereafter, Jewish immigration would be prohibited without the consent of the Arab community. In some regions, the sale of land to Jewish settlers was banned, while in others it was permitted, though the final decision rested with the High Commissioner for Palestine. The Palestinian Jews rejected the White Paper, yet they nonetheless supported Britain in the war against Hitler. They understood that a victory for the Third Reich would represent a far greater evil for the Jewish people than the restrictions on entry into Palestine. Thousands of Palestinian Jews fought in the ranks of the Jewish Brigade, a unit of the British Army.
War, the UN partition, and the birth of a state. Following World War II, Britain did not lift its restrictions on Jewish immigration to Palestine. The Jewish population viewed Britain's conduct as a betrayal and began to challenge its right to control Palestine. The Haganah, the primary Zionist military organization, rose up against the British administration, joining forces with the Irgun and Lehi groups. Jewish radicals blew up bridges and railway tracks and carried out terrorist attacks against administrative buildings. The most notorious of these incidents was the bombing of the King David Hotel, which housed the headquarters of the British administration in 1946. That attack claimed the lives of 91 people. These organizations also engaged in the clandestine transport of Jews from Europe into Palestine, a practice that fueled growing resentment among the Arab population. In April 1947, Great Britain called upon the UN General Assembly to provide a solution to the Palestine question. A special committee considered two options. The first proposed partitioning Palestine into separate Arab and Jewish states, with Jerusalem designated as a neutral zone. The second proposed establishing a single, unified state shared by both Arabs and Jews. The first option was more amenable to the Jews, though the Arabs were unwilling to cede any territory. The second option was preferred by the Arabs, but the Jews rejected it outright, as they would once again find themselves a national minority within the new state. By that time, the world had already divided into two distinct camps, one led by the United States and the other by the Soviet Union. The fate of Palestine thus came to rest in the hands of these two superpowers. The Soviet Union's initial stance was unequivocal. Zionism was a pernicious, semi-fascist ideology, while the Arabs were merely defending their homeland against colonialism. Within the USSR itself, the authorities showed no leniency toward Zionists. They were subjected to repression, executed, or forced into exile. The Soviet state even went so far as to ban the Hebrew language, permitting only Yiddish, deemed class-friendly, to be spoken. The United States, for its part, feared an alliance between Arabs and communists. Some members of the American political elite believed that the U.S. should stand up for Palestinian Muslims so as not to damage relations with them. At the same time, however, there were far more Jewish voters in the U.S. than Muslim ones. Democratic mechanisms were at work. Americans tended to favor the creation of two states in Palestine, yet they also wished to take Arab interests into account. On May 14, 1947, during a session of the UN General Assembly, Andrei Gromyko, the USSR's permanent representative to the organization, took the podium. Everyone present had a rough idea of what they were about to hear. Yet, unexpectedly, Gromyko began by speaking of the immense suffering the Jewish people had endured during the Second World War, noting that not a single Western European nation had come to their aid. Now, he argued, the Jews sought to establish a state of their own, a desire that was entirely logical. Gromyko added that, from the USSR's perspective, the optimal solution would be a single, joint Jewish-Arab state. However, should the UN deem the conflict irresolvable, the only alternative would be the creation of two separate states. Gromyko's speech dropped like a bombshell. No one had expected such a pro-Zionist stance from the USSR. Naturally, this was not merely a personal whim of Gromyko's. He was clearly articulating Moscow's official position. Stalin believed that a pro-Soviet Jewish state in Palestine would help undermine British dominance in the Middle East. In November 1947, the UN adopted a resolution to partition the British Mandate of Palestine into separate Arab and Jewish territories. Voting in favor were the Ukrainian and Belarusian SSRs, the United States, Canada, and France. 13 nations voted against, specifically the Muslim states, India, Greece, and Cuba. 10 nations abstained, including Britain, China, and Yugoslavia. The air was already thick with the scent of war. Outraged Palestinian Arabs, deprived of fertile lands and seaports as a result of the partition, struck first. The Jews retaliated in kind, and the spiral of violence began to spin out of control. The British did not intervene, as they were in the process of packing up and withdrawing. The Americans declined to dispatch troops to the Middle East to maintain order. The Jews found themselves a minority, encircled by hostile Arab states and bereft of serious weaponry or funds. In January 1948, Zionist leader David Ben-Gurion sent Golda Meir to the United States to raise funds among wealthy Jews. No one believed she would manage to collect even $10 million, yet Meir returned with $50 million. This was a phenomenal sum, approximately $400 million in today's currency. Now the Jews needed weapons. While there was no shortage of arms left over from World War II, acquiring them was no easy task, as an embargo on arms shipments to Palestine was in effect. Suddenly, assistance was offered by the Communists who controlled Czechoslovakia. The country's industrial sector had served the Third Reich throughout the war, and a substantial stockpile of weaponry remained there. This was yet another of Stalin's anti-Western strategic maneuvers. In the spring of 1948, the first shipments of machine guns, rifles, and ammunition from Czechoslovakia were dispatched to the Jewish sector of Palestine. In addition to small arms and ammunition, the Israelis purchased the backbone of their future air force from the Czechoslovaks, 25 Avia S-199 fighter jets, a Czechoslovak variant of the Messerschmitt. And just in time, too. The situation in Palestine had reached a critical juncture. The armies of the Arab nations were massed along its borders, waiting only for the British mandate to expire and for Her Majesty's troops to head home. The First War and the Consolidation of Independence. On May 14, 1948, at 4 p.m., exactly 8 hours before the expiration of the British mandate, David Ben-Gurion proclaimed the establishment of the Jewish State of Israel within the territory allocated by the United Nations. In practical terms, the United States was the first nation to recognize Israel's existence. President Harry Truman announced this on that very same day. However, from a legal standpoint, the Soviet Union was the first to recognize Israel, an act that took place on May 17th. Great Britain, however, did not officially recognize the Jewish state until April 1950. On the very morning following its proclamation, the Arab League declared war on the new nation. 5 countries, Syria, Lebanon, Transjordan, Egypt, and Iraq, immediately launched an attack on Israel. The Transjordanian army seized control of Samaria, East Jerusalem, and Judea. Iraqi forces advanced as far as Netanya, while Lebanese and Syrian troops took control of territories in northern Israel. It seemed that Israel, having existed for only a few days, was destined to vanish from the face of the earth. Yet at that very moment, help arrived. On the night of May 24th, ships carrying Czechoslovakian weaponry docked at the port of Haifa. Cargo planes delivered the first 4 Avia S-199 fighter jets, transported in a disassembled state. At that time, this constituted the entire air fleet of the Israeli Air Force. The first aerial combat took place on May 29th. The Israeli pilots were unable to inflict serious damage. Their cannons jammed, but the Egyptians panicked. They had not expected the Jews to possess any strike aircraft. Consequently, the Egyptian tanks halted their advance on Tel Aviv. By the spring of 1949, Israel had concluded armistice agreements with the majority of its adversaries. As a result, the Jewish state retained control of the corridor connecting Jerusalem to the coastal plain, as well as western Galilee. Jerusalem itself, however, was partitioned between Israel and Jordan. Later that same year, 1949, Israel was admitted to the United Nations. It was at long last recognized as a sovereign state on equal footing with all others. Afterbirth, wars, Aliyah, and a difficult peace. The first decades of Israel's existence proved no less dramatic than the struggle for its creation. The War of 1948 to 1949 turned into a catastrophe for the Arabs, the Nakba, and gave rise to the Palestinian refugee problem, which remains unresolved to this day. Approximately 700,000 Arabs left or were forced to leave their homes. In response, roughly the same number of Jews fled Arab countries, where they had lived for centuries in the years that followed, settling in Israel. 2 tragedies, 2 peoples, 1 land. The state grew rapidly. The Law of Return of 1950 granted every Jew in the world the right to repatriation.
Hundreds of thousands of Jews poured in from all directions, from Morocco and Yemen, from Romania and Poland, from Iraq and Ethiopia. By the mid-1950s, the population had doubled. The country built itself literally from nothing. Swamps were drained, kibbutzim were established in the middle of the desert, and roads were paved into the void, in anticipation of cities yet to be built. There was no respite. In 1956, Israel, together with Britain and France, participated in the Suez War against Egypt. In June 1967, the Six-Day War erupted, one of the swiftest military campaigns in history. In just 6 days, Israel routed the armies of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, occupying the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights. The country's territory tripled, yet, along with the land, Israel acquired 1 million Arab inhabitants in the occupied territories and a new, intractable knot of contradictions. In October 1973, Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Yom Kippur, the holiest Jewish holiday. Israel barely held its ground. The war cost the nation 3,000 lives, dealt a painful blow to its national pride, and ultimately led to the first-ever peace treaty between Israel and an Arab state. In 1979, Egypt and Israel signed the Camp David Accords, for which their leaders, Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin, were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. For Sadat, this peace came at the cost of his life. 2 years later, he was assassinated by Islamic radicals. Hope and its collapse. Peace negotiations proceeded in parallel. The 1993 Oslo Accords established the Palestinian Authority and appeared to be the first step toward a two-state solution for two peoples. However, in November 1995, Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was shot dead by an Israeli nationalist at a peace rally in Tel Aviv. That bullet halted not only a man, but also the momentum. Negotiations continued on inertia, lacking their former resolve. In 2000, the Camp David summit, hosted by President Clinton, ended in failure. The parties were unable to reach an agreement regarding the status of Jerusalem and the refugees' right of return. In the autumn of that same year, 2000, the Second Intifada began. Bombings on buses, in cafes, supermarkets, and at weddings. It was a war without a front line, a war waged within the fabric of daily life. Over the course of 4 years, more than 1,000 Israelis and several thousand Palestinians lost their lives. Israel constructed a concrete barrier in the West Bank. While this move drastically reduced terrorist attacks, it drew condemnation from the international community. Gaza, Hezbollah, and the Axis of Resistance. In 2005, Prime Minister Ariel Sharon took an unexpected step. He withdrew all Israeli settlements and troops from the Gaza Strip. Many Israelis hoped that this withdrawal would pave the way for peace. Instead, in 2007, Hamas seized control of Gaza by force, expelling the Palestinian Authority. Since then, this small strip of land along the Mediterranean coast has become a perpetual source of conflict. Rockets, military operations, ceasefires, and then more rockets. Israel conducted large-scale operations in 2008 to 2009, 2012, and 2014, each time failing to achieve a definitive resolution. To the north, another threat was mounting. The Lebanese Hezbollah, funded by Iran, had amassed tens of thousands of rockets by the mid-2020s. In 2006, the group provoked a 34-day war that claimed the lives of over 1,000 Lebanese and 150 Israelis, ultimately ending in an inconclusive outcome. On the diplomatic front, unexpected developments were unfolding. In 2020, brokered by the Trump administration, Israel signed the Abraham Accords with the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan. Arab nations, which for decades had refused to normalize relations, extended a hand of friendship. It appeared the region was entering a new era. Saudi Arabia was widely cited as the next in line for reconciliation.
October 7, 2023. On the morning of Saturday, October 7th, 2023, the anniversary of the Yom Kippur War, and once again without warning, Hamas militants breached the Gaza perimeter. Approximately 3,000 individuals stormed into Israeli kibbutzim and a youth music festival. Roughly 1,200 people were killed, and another 251 were taken hostage. It was the bloodiest day in Israel's history since 1948, and, simultaneously, the greatest failure of Israeli intelligence in half a century. Israel responded with Operation Iron Swords. The head of the Hamas Politburo, Ismail Haniyeh, was killed at his residence in Tehran in July 2024, while the leaders of the militant wing in Gaza, Yahya Sinwar and Mohammed Deif, were also eliminated in the course of Israeli strikes. According to the Hamas-controlled Ministry of Health, 44,000 Palestinians died in the Strip during the war. Of these, according to UN estimates, 70% were women and children. The humanitarian catastrophe sparked a rift within the international community. In November 2024, the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for Prime Minister Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Gallant, accusing them of depriving the civilian population of Gaza of access to food, water, and medical supplies. Amidst the escalating conflict, the number of countries recognizing a Palestinian state grew significantly. In 2025, the United Kingdom, France, Australia, Canada, and a number of other nations did so. The war expands. The conflict quickly spread beyond the borders of Gaza. In the autumn of 2024, Israel launched massive strikes against Lebanon. In late September 2024, Hassan Nasrallah, who had led Hezbollah since 1992, was eliminated. In early October, the Israeli military launched a ground operation in southern Lebanon. In November, a ceasefire agreement came into effect, obliging Hezbollah to withdraw behind the Litani River, a development experts viewed as a strategic defeat for the group. In December 2024, the regime of Bashar al-Assad collapsed in neighboring Syria. Following this, the Israeli military occupied the buffer zone in the Golan Heights. In January 2025, a ceasefire was reached in Gaza, and a phased exchange of hostages began. However, on the night of March 18, 2025, Israel resumed combat operations in the Strip after negotiations regarding the second phase of the deal reached an impasse. Under the command of its new chief of the General Staff, Eyal Zamir, the military launched Operation Gideon's Chariots, an operation far larger in scale and more aggressive than its predecessor. In the summer of 2025, the war escalated to an entirely new level. On June 13, 2025, Israel launched a full-scale military operation against Iran, striking nuclear facilities in Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan. On June 22, the United States joined the operation, launching strikes against uranium enrichment centers. On June 24, the parties concluded a ceasefire, bringing an end to the 12-day war. On October 9, 2025, a ceasefire was agreed upon in the Gaza Strip, and on October 13, the last 20 surviving Israeli hostages were returned. April 2026. Israel enters its 8th decade with a mixed record. The military objectives, the destruction of Hamas's military potential, the neutralization of Hezbollah, and a strike against the Iranian nuclear program have, to a significant extent, been achieved. Yet the cost is immense. International isolation, ICC arrest warrants, tens of thousands dead in Gaza, and unanswered questions regarding the post-war governance of the territories. What will become of Gaza remains unclear. The same applies to the two-state solution. A nation born in 1948 under the banner of "Never Again" once again confronts a dilemma that neither force nor negotiation has resolved over more than 7 decades. How to coexist with those who deny your very right to exist, and how to allow those who simply wish to live on the same land to do so.